Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are completing the rest of Book 2 of The Will to Power by Nietzsche, and we are going to start with Aphorism number 448 under the title The Truths and Errors of Philosophers. Philosophy defined by Kant. Quote, the science of the limitations of reason, end quote. 449. According to Aristotle, philosophy is the art of discovering truth. On the other hand, the Epicureans, who availed themselves of Aristotle's sensual theory of knowledge, retorted in ironical opposition to the search for truth, philosophy is the art of life. 450. The three great naivetés: knowledge as a means of happiness, knowledge as a means to virtue, knowledge as a means to the denial of life, inasmuch as it leads to disappointment. 451. As if there were a quote-unquote truth which one could by some means approach. 452. Error and ignorance are fatal. The assumption that truth has been found and that ignorance and error are at an end constitutes one of the most seductive thoughts in the world. Granted that it be generally accepted, it paralyzes the will to test, to investigate, to be cautious, and to gather experience. It may even be regarded as criminal, that is to say, as a doubt concerning truth. Quote-unquote truth is therefore more fatal than error and ignorance, because it paralyzes the forces which lead to enlightenment and knowledge. The passion for idleness now stands up for truth. Thought is pain and misery, as also do order, rule, and joy of possession, the pride of wisdom, in fact, vanity. It is easier to obey than to examine. It is more gratifying to think, I possess the truth, than to see only darkness in all directions. But above all, it is reassuring, it lends confidence, and alleviates life. It improves the character inasmuch as it reduces mistrust. Spiritual peace, a quiet conscience, these things are inventions which are only possible provided truth be found. By their fruits you shall know them. Truth is the truth because it makes men better. The process goes on. All goodness and all success is placed to the credit of truth. This is the proof by success. The happiness, contentment, and the welfare of a community or of an individual are now understood to be the result of the belief in morality. Conversely, failure is ascribed to a lack of faith. 453. The causes of error lie just as much in the good as in the bad will of man. In an incalculable number of cases, he conceals reality from himself. He falsifies it, so that he may not suffer from his good or bad will. God, for instance, is considered the shaper of a man's destiny. He interprets his little lot as though everything were intentionally sent to him for the salvation of his soul. This act of ignorance and philology, which to a more subtle intellect would seem unclean and false, is done in the majority of cases with perfect good faith. Goodwill, noble feelings, and lofty states of the soul are just as underhand and deceptive in the means they use as are the passions love, hatred, and revenge, which morality has repudiated and declared to be egoistic. Errors are what mankind has had to pay for most dearly, and taking them all in all, the errors which have resulted from goodwill are those which have wrought the most harm. The illusion which makes people happy is more harmful than the illusion which is immediately followed by evil results. The latter increases keenness and mistrust and purifies the understanding. The former merely narcoticizes. Fine feelings and noble impulses ought, speaking physiologically, to be classified with narcotics. Their abuse is followed by precisely the same results as the abuse of any other opiate: weak nerves. 454. Error is the most expensive luxury that man can indulge in, and if the error happen to be a physiological one, it is fatal to life. What has mankind paid for most dearly hitherto? For its quote-unquote truths, for every one of these were errors in physiologicis. 455. Psychological confusions. The desire for belief is confounded with the will to truth, for instance in Carlyle. But the desire for disbelief has also been confounded with the will to truth, a need of ridding oneself of a belief for 100 reasons, in order to carry one's point against certain believers. What is it that inspires skeptics? The hatred of dogmatists, or a need of repose, weariness as in Pyrrho's case? The advantages which were expected to come from truth were the advantages resulting from a belief in it. For, in itself, truth could have been thoroughly painful, harmful, and even fatal. Likewise, truth was combated only on account of the advantages which a victory over it would provide, for instance, emancipation from the yoke of the ruling powers. The method of truth was not based upon motives of truthfulness, but upon motives of power, upon the desire to be superior. How is truth proved? By means of the feeling of increased power, by means of utility, by means of indispensability. In short, by means of its advantages. That is to say, hypotheses concerning what truth should be like in order that it may be embraced by us. But this involves prejudice. It is a sign that truth does not enter the question at all. What is the meaning of the will to truth, for instance, in the Goncourts, and in the Naturalists, a criticism of objectivity? Why should we know? Why should we not prefer to be deceived? But what was needed was always belief, and not truth. Belief is created by means which are quite opposed to the method of investigation. It even depends upon the exclusion of the latter. 456. A certain degree of faith suffices today to give us an objection to what is believed. It does more. It makes us question the spiritual healthiness of the believer. 457. Martyrs. To combat anything that is based upon reverence, opponents must be possessed of both daring and recklessness, and be hindered by no scruples. Now, if one considers that for thousands of years man has sanctified as truths only those things which were in reality errors, and that he has branded any criticism of them with the hallmark of badness, one will have to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that a goodly amount of immoral deeds were necessary in order to give the initiative to an attack, I mean to reason. That these immoralists have always posed as the martyrs of truth should be forgiven them. The truth of the matter is that they did not stand up and deny owing to an instinct for truth, but because of a love of dissolution, criminal skepticism, and the love of adventure. In other cases, it is personal rancor which drives them into the province of problems. They only combat certain points of view in order to be able to carry their point against certain people. But above all, it is revenge which has become scientifically useful, the revenge of the oppressed, those who, thanks to the truth that happens to be ruling, have been pressed aside and even smothered. Truth, that is to say the scientific method, was grasped and favored by such as recognized that it was a useful weapon of war, an instrument of destruction. In order to be honored as opponents, they were moreover obliged to use an apparatus similar to those used by those whom they were attacking. They therefore brandished the concept truth as absolutely as their adversaries did. They became fanatics, at least in their poses, because no other pose could be expected to be taken seriously. What still remained to be done was left to persecution, to passion, and the uncertainty of the persecuted. Hatred waxed great, and the first impulse began to die away and to leave the field entirely to science. Ultimately, all of them wanted to be right in the same absurd way as their opponents. The word conviction, faith, the pride of martyrdom, these things are most unfavorable to knowledge. The adversaries of truth finally adopt the whole subjective manner of deciding about truth, that is to say, by means of poses, sacrifices, and heroic resolutions, and thus prolong the dominion of the anti-scientific method. As martyrs, they compromise their very own deed. 458. The dangerous distinction between theoretical and practical, in Kant, for instance, but also in the ancient philosophers. They behave as if pure intellectuality presented them with the problems of science and metaphysics. They behave as if practice should be judged by a measure of its own, whatever the judgment of theory may be. Against the first tendency, I said of my Psychology of Philosophers, their strangest calculations and intellectuality are still but the last pallid impress of a physiological fact. Spontaneity is absolutely lacking in them. Everything is instinct. Everything is intended to follow a certain direction from the first. Against the second tendency, I put my question, whether we know another method of acting correctly, besides that of thinking correctly. The last case is action. The first presupposes thought. Are we possessed of a means whereby we can judge of the value of a method of life differently from the value of a theory, through induction or comparison? Guileless people imagine that in this respect we are better equipped. We know what is quote-unquote good, and the philosophers are content to repeat this view. We conclude that some sort of faith is at work in this matter and nothing more. Quote, men must act, consequently rules of conduct are necessary. End quote. This is even what the ancient skeptics thought. The urgent need of a definite decision in this department of knowledge is used as an argument in favor of regarding something as true. Quote, men must not act, end quote, said their more consistent brothers, the Buddhists, and then thought out a mode of conduct which would deliver man from the yoke of action. To adapt oneself, to live as the common man lives, and to regard as right and proper what he regards as right, this is submission to the gregarious instinct. One must carry one's courage and severity so far as to learn to consider such submission a disgrace. One should not live according to two standards. One should not separate theory and practice. 459. Of all that which was formerly held to be true, not one word is to be credited. Everything which was formerly disdained as unholy, forbidden, contemptible, and fatal, all these flowers now bloom on the most charming paths of truth. The whole of this old morality concerns us no longer. It contains not one idea which is still worthy of respect. We have outlived it. We are no longer sufficiently coarse and guileless to be forced to allow ourselves to be lied to in this way. In more polite language, we are too virtuous for it. And if truth in the old sense were true only because the old morality said yea to it, and had a right to say yea to it, it follows that no truth of the past can any longer be of use to us. Our criterion of truth is certainly not morality. We refute an assertion when we show that it is dependent upon morality and is inspired by noble feelings. 460. All these values are empirical and conditioned. But he who believes in them and who honors them refuses to acknowledge this aspect of them. All philosophers believe in these values, and one form their reverence takes is the endeavor to make a priori truths out of them, the falsifying nature of reverence. Reverence is the supreme test of intellectual honesty, but in the whole history of philosophy there is no such thing as intellectual honesty, but the, quote, love of goodness, end quote. On the one hand, there is an absolute lack of method in testing the value of these values. Secondly, there is a general disinclination either to test them or to regard them as conditioned at all. All anti-scientific instincts assembled around moral values in order to keep science out of this department. 4. Concluding remarks in the criticism of philosophy. 461. Why philosophers are slanderers. The artful and blind hostility of philosophers towards the senses. What an amount of mob and middle-class qualities lie in all this hatred. The crowd always believes that an abuse of which it feels the harmful results constitutes an objection to the thing which happens to be abused. All insurrectionary movements against principles, whether in politics or agriculture, always follow a line of argument suggested by this ulterior motive. The abused must be shown to be necessary to, and inherent in, the principle. It is a woeful history. Mankind looks for a principle from the standpoint of which he will be able to condemn man. He invents a world in order to be able to slander and throw mud at this world. As a matter of fact, he snatches every time at nothing, and construes this nothing as God, as truth, and in any case as judge and detractor of this existence. If one should require a proof of how deeply and thoroughly the actually barbarous needs of man, even in his present state of tameness and civilization, still seek gratification, one should contemplate the leitmotifs of the whole of the evolution of philosophy, a sort of revenge upon reality, a surreptitious process of destroying the values by means of which men live, a dissatisfied soul to which the conditions of discipline is one of torture, and which takes a particular pleasure in morbidly severing all the bonds that bind it to such a condition. The history of philosophy is the story of a secret and mad hatred of the prerequisites of life, of the feelings which make for the real values of life, and of all the partisanship in favor of life. Philosophers have never hesitated to affirm a fanciful world, provided it contradicted this world, and furnished them with a weapon wherewith they could calumniate this world. Up to the present, philosophy has been the grand school of slander, and its power has been so great that even today our science, which pretends to be the advocate of life, has accepted the fundamental position of slander, and treats this world as appearance, and this chain of causes as though it were only phenomenal. What is the hatred which is active here? I fear that it is still the Circe of philosophers, morality, which plays the trick of compelling them to be ever slanderers. They believed in moral truths, in these that they thought they had found the highest values. What alternative had they left, save that of denying existence, ever more emphatically, the more they got to know about it? For this life is immoral, and it is based upon immoral first principles, and morality says nay to life. Let us suppress the real world, and in order to do this we must first suppress the highest values current hitherto, morals. It is enough to show that morality itself is immoral, in the same sense as that in which immorality has been condemned heretofore. If an end be thus made to the tyranny of the former values, if we have suppressed the real world, a new order of values must follow of its own accord. The world of appearance and the world of lies, this constitutes the contradiction. The latter hitherto has been the real world, truth, God. This is the one which we still have to suppress. The logic of my conception. 1. Morality as the highest value. It is master of all the phases of philosophy, even of the skeptics. Result. This world is no good. It is not the real world. 2. What is it that determines the highest value here? What, in sooth, is morality? It is the instinct of decadence. It is the means whereby the exhausted and the degenerate revenge themselves. Historical proof. Philosophers have always been decadents, in the service of nihilistic religions. 3. It is the instinct of decadence coming to the fore as will to power. Proof. The absolute immorality of the means employed by morality throughout its history. General aspect. The values which have been highest hitherto constitute a specific case of the will to power. Morality itself is a specific case of immorality. 462. The principal innovations, instead of moral values, nothing but naturalistic values, naturalization of morality. In the place of sociology, a doctrine of the forms of dominion. In the place of society, the complex whole of culture, which is my chief interest, whether in its entirety or in parts. In the place of the theory of knowledge, a doctrine which has laid down the value of the passions. To this a hierarchy of the passions would belong. The passions transfigured, their superior rank, their quote-unquote spirituality. In the place of metaphysics and religion, the doctrine of eternal recurrence, this being regarded as a means to the breeding and selection of men. 463. My precursors. Schopenhauer. To what extent I deepened pessimism and first brought its full meaning within my grasp, by means of its most extreme opposite. Likewise, the higher Europeans, the pioneers of great politics. Likewise, the Greeks in their Genesis. 464. I have named those who were unconsciously my workers and precursors. But in what direction may I turn with any hope of finding my particular kind of philosophers themselves, or at least my yearning for new philosophers? In that direction alone where a noble attitude of mind prevails, an attitude of mind which believes in slavery and in manifold orders of rank, as the prerequisites of any high degree of culture. In that direction alone where a creative attitude of mind prevails, an attitude of mind which does not regard the world of happiness and repose, the Sabbath of Sabbaths, as an end to be desired, and which even in peace honors the means which lead to new wars, an attitude of mind which would prescribe laws for the future, which for the sake of the future would treat everything that exists today with harshness and even tyranny, a daring and immoral attitude of mind, which would wish to see both the good and the evil qualities in man developed to their fullest extent, because it would feel itself able to put each in its right place, that is to say, in that place in which each would need the other. But what prospect has he of finding what he seeks, who goes in search of philosophers today? Is it not probable that even with the best Diogenes lantern in his land, he will wander about by night and day in vain? This age is possessed of the opposite instincts. What it wants above all is comfort. Secondly, it wants publicity and the deafening din of actors' voices, the big drum which appeals to its bank holiday tastes. Thirdly, that everyone should lie on his belly in utter subjection before the greatest of all lies, which is the equality of men, and should honor only those virtues which make men equal and place them in equal positions. But in this way, the rise of the philosopher, as I understand him, is made completely impossible, despite the fact that many may regard the present tendencies as rather favorable to his advent. As a matter of fact, the whole world mourns today the hard times that philosophers used to have, hemmed in between the fear of the stake, a guilty conscience, and the presumptuous wisdom of the fathers of the Church. But the truth is that precisely these conditions were ever so much more favorable to the education of a mighty, extensive, subtle, rash, and daring intellect than the conditions prevailing today. At present, another kind of intellect, the intellect of the demagogue, of the actor, and perhaps of the beaver and ant like scholar too, finds the best possible condition for its development. But even for artists of a superior caliber, the conditions are already far from favorable. For does not every one of them, almost, perish owing to his want of discipline? They are no longer tyrannized over by an outside power, by the tables of the absolute values enforced by a church or by a monarch, and thus they no longer learn to develop their inner tyrant, their will. And what holds good of artists also holds good to a greater and more fatal degree of philosophers. Where, then, are free spirits to be found today? Let anyone show me a free spirit today. 465. Under spiritual freedom, I understand something very definite. It is a state in which one is 100 times superior to philosophers and other disciples of quote-unquote truth in one's severity towards oneself, in one's uprightness, in one's courage, and in one's absolute will to say nay, even when it is dangerous to say nay. I regard the philosophers that have appeared heretofore as contemptible libertines, hiding behind the petticoats of the female truth. End of Volume 1. This is the end of Part 12 of The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.